Tonight we're beginning a brand new study in the book of 1 Thessalonians. And my goal tonight is to give you some background information about Paul, the church, the city, and all that took place back in the first century. And then next week we're going to start with chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going to make our way through the entire book over a period of several weeks, and we'll do that verse by verse. But Paul writes this letter that we call 1 Thessalonians because there is a second letter that we call 2 Thessalonians. And Paul writes this out of a deep love and concern for the church. As we're going to find out from Acts chapter 17, that Paul founded the church along with Silas and Timothy, but they had to leave rather suddenly. And Paul felt that his ministry really wasn't done there, but he had no choice but to leave town. And then he began to wonder, this church, will it survive? Will it keep going? And will it make it through the persecution and the difficulties that it's going to encounter? So Paul is concerned. He apparently, the time he was there, really fell in love with these people, and he wants to encourage them in their faith. Paul also reminds them in his teaching about Christ's second coming, that Jesus is coming again. So as they're enduring persecution, he wants them to hang on because things will be better when Christ returns. And it's interesting that in writing this book about 20 years after Jesus had ascended into heaven, the first century church was expecting Jesus to come right back down to earth. So they weren't expecting, 2,000 years of church history. They were expecting everything to end in that generation. And I think just about every generation since that time has expected Jesus to return, including ours. So as we look at the signs and look at our world, we're thinking that Jesus could come back soon. And that was even true in the first century. Well, the church is in the city of Thessalonica. And Thessalonica was a port city. And the most amazing thing is that Thessalonica continues to exist today. It's in Greece. It's right up here in the green. The name is pronounced a little bit different. It's now Thessaloniki, so it's Greek. But it's easy to spot when you find a map of Greece because it's really close to these, what they call the three fingers, because those three little peninsulas look like three fingers. And they're right there, and Thessalonica is just up on the coast, and a very important city. It has an incredible history. It was founded in 315 BC by Cassander, who named the city after his wife. So Thessalonica was a woman's name. That was her name, and he named the city after her. Well, kind of backing up a little bit, this whole area, as we go back to the first century, is called Macedonia. And this is basically a map of Paul's second missionary journey, but it shows this whole area of Macedonia. And back in 359 BC, Philip II controlled Macedonia. And in fact, he grew the area, he made it strong, he established it, and it became one of the most popular and one of the most powerful Greek states. And he had these great dreams of conquering the Persians. At this point, the Persian Empire was the world empire, but he wanted to cross the Aegean Sea and go into Asia Minor and take on the Persians. In fact, he sends troops into Asia Minor about 336 BC, hoping to battle them and take some of their territory, but he was assassinated before he could get there. And so after Philip II died, his son took over. His son's name was Alexander. And Alexander was a very determined young man. And he decided to pick up where his dad left off. And not only did Alexander conquer some of Asia Minor, he conquered this entire area that's in whatever that shade of orange is. So he conquered basically the Persian Empire and took it over for himself. His name became Alexander the Great. Because within a decade, he had conquered Persia. And it was interesting that the Greeks have been trying to conquer Persia for years. And nobody was really able to do it until Alexander the Great. And this extended all the way down into Egypt. It also included Thessalonica. See the three fingers there. You can always spot that. Also down in here is Judah and Jerusalem. And it extended all the way towards India. So it became a massive empire, just like the Persian Empire was a massive empire. So Alexander loved to fight battles. And apparently he was really good at it because he defeated everyone. But what Alexander did not like was governing people after he conquered them. But somebody had to do that. So he left that in charge of regents or magistrates who would be in charge of certain areas to govern that area. Macedonia, which again is over here, was in charge. The man in charge was Antipater. And he was in charge for a while, but then he passed away in 316 BC. And he left someone in charge named Polyperchon. And he was to take his place. However, Antipater's son, Cassander, defeated Polyperchon and took over Macedonia. And that's when he basically restored this entire area of Macedonia. And that's when he established Thessalonica as a city. It was a seaport, a very prosperous city. And that's where the name came from. It was named after his wife. And it remained in control of the Greeks until 168 BC. And there was another empire on the rise around 168 BC, and that was the Romans. And the Romans took over that area. And under Roman rule, they divided Macedonia into 4 zones or 4 sections. It just so happens that Thessalonica is the capital city of zone number 2, or region number 2. And Thessalonica is located right above the number 2 there. So the Romans decided to divide it into 4 different sections. It was easier to govern that way. And then Thessalonica became a Roman province in 148 BC, then a senatorial province by the time of the Apostle Paul. And the administrative capital was in Thessalonica. The people of Thessalonica happened to side with the winners of the Battle of Philadelphia, or Philippi rather, in 42 BC. And because of that, Thessalonica became a free city. So they were able to govern themselves, basically using a Greek model instead of a Roman model. And being a free city, they had their own magistrates, and they were in charge. Now, as long as there's no rioting, as long as there's no uprisings, Thessalonica is a free city, and Rome will leave them alone. But if there's riots, if there's difficulties, then Rome will have to step in, and Thessalonica might lose its status as a free city. The Romans loved peace. They did not like riots and uprisings. So as long as there weren't any of those, and everybody paid their taxes, the Romans were happy. But if there were issues, then the Romans would have to step in. Well, as it turns out, Thessalonica is a very prosperous city. It's right there on the seaport. A lot of trade routes went through Thessalonica. It had very fertile soil. It was a great place to live. There was about 200,000 people who lived there in the days of the Apostle Paul. So Paul went there on his second missionary journey, and there was also a large Jewish population there. Romans says that the gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And that was kind of Paul's strategy. When he went into a city, he would first of all talk to the Jewish people in the synagogue. Then once he got kicked out, which he normally did, he went and talked to the Gentiles about Jesus. And then he tried to form a church from those who believed. So that's a little bit of information about the town, the city of Thessalonica. Let me talk now about Paul and the church at Thessalonica and how it all got started. And there's a story in the book of Acts about how it all got started. And that's in Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 10. And let me kind of run through that story. It says, when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. So let me back up here and show you a little bit about this second missionary journey. Paul and Silas, and possibly Timothy as well, were in the city of Philippi. And there were good things that happened in Philippi and not so good things that happened in Philippi. One of the good things is that many responded to the gospel when a church was established. That was a good thing. But eventually Paul got arrested by the city leaders, and for some reason, Paul didn't tell them that he was a Roman citizen. Because back in the days of the Roman Empire, if you were a Roman citizen, you had rights, and no one would dare violate your rights. But Paul and Silas are accused of things, they're thrown into jail, and they are beaten. And they spend the night in the stocks, and around midnight they're singing, praising God. Their chains fall off, the Philippian jailer becomes a believer in Jesus, and the next day there was a bit of an issue, because word got around that these two guys you beat were Roman citizens. And Paul decided to just let it go. He could have reported them. Those magistrates could have lost their job or their lives. You never know. But Paul decided simply to move on. So he leaves Philippi and he travels to Thessalonica, which I'm sure by the time he got there, he was a little weaker, just having been beaten and thrown in jail. But he arrives in this city of Thessalonica, and he begins his ministry in the synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. So Paul was a Jewish rabbi. So he could go into the Jewish synagogue and be allowed to speak. And apparently they let him speak for 3 straight weeks. So for 21 days, he's there ministering with the Jewish people in the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbath days, he reasons with them from the Scriptures. Goes on to say, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. The problem was, no Jewish people believed that. They expected their Messiah to ride in on a white horse, gather up an army, defeat all of their enemies, gain their independence, and sit on a throne. There's nothing about suffering and dying and rising again. But Paul had to prove from the Hebrew Scriptures that Messiah was going to do that. Perhaps Paul reasoned from Psalm 22. It was a rather interesting description of a crucifixion, written before crucifixion was invented. Also Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant, which some Jewish people thought was a reference to the nation. Others believed was a reference to the Messiah. So he reasoned with them that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. So this Jesus who came and was crucified and rose from the dead is the Messiah. And that was Paul's message, and he had to reason with the Jewish people to try to prove to them that that's true. And some of the Jews were persuaded. Doesn't say most, doesn't say all. Some of the Jews were persuaded, and they joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks. Now, in the Jewish synagogue, the Jewish people allowed Gentiles to attend. And a lot of these Gentiles would attend the Jewish synagogue. They loved the Jewish law, because if you were worshiping the gods and the goddesses, there were no ethics or morals in all of that. In fact, the gods and goddesses were corrupt for the most part. So they loved the ethics of the Jewish people. And so they would sit in the synagogue and they would learn. Some would become Jews, and if you were male, you had to be circumcised. And that kept a lot of the males from going, no, we'll just kind of sit back here and watch and listen, and we're just not going to join up with the Jewish movement. So they're called God-fearing Greeks. They're Gentiles, but they're attending Jewish synagogue, and they know something about the God of heaven because of that. And quite a few prominent women. Thessalonica was a prosperous city, a lot of trade, a lot of industry, and some of those trades were run by women. So women had an opportunity to become rather wealthy in large cities like Thessalonica. They weren't held back, and so some prominent wealthy women joined the movement as well. But other Jews were jealous. They began seeing some of their fellow Jews leave the synagogue and join this new movement that was proclaiming that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. And those who didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah thought those others were making a mistake, and somehow we have to stop them from making that mistake of believing in Jesus. So they become jealous, so they round up some bad characters from the marketplace. They form a mob, and they start a riot in the city. Well, that's a way to get attention. Because the city officials don't like riots. If riots get out of control, they can lose their job or their life. So they need to keep the peace. So they've got to do something to stop the riot. So their strategy is to start this riot, bring in Paul and Silas as the two bad guys, convince the city officials that these guys are bad and they're guilty, and so you need to get rid of them, as in execute them, and then everything's going to be fine again. So that was their strategy, that was their thinking, and in many ways, it wasn't a bad strategy because the city officials aren't going to let this riot continue, and somebody had to have started it. Who was it? Well, they rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas. Paul and Silas are staying with a man named Jason. So they rush into Jason's house to find Paul and Silas. They've started this riot. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So, you can't just have a riot every day. They've done this, so they need to bring the guilty people into the public square and charge them in front of the city officials, and they need to do it immediately. So they search for them in order to bring them out to the crowd, but they can't find them. Have no idea where Paul and Silas were, but they weren't at Jason's house. So these people do the next best thing. They drag Jason and some other believers before the city officials. Can't find Paul, can't find Silas, but we've got Jason and some others that we can bring charges against. And it's interesting what they say about them. These men who have caused trouble all over the world. If you have a King James translation, it will say these men who have turned the world upside down. And that's pretty much what Christianity did to the Roman Empire. It turned the world upside down. And basically, the way they say it is they're these troublemakers. And these guys have been causing trouble all over the place. Now they've come to our town as well. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. Well, if you can't find Paul and Silas, we've got Jason who welcomed them, so Jason must be guilty. So if Jason has invited them into his home, that means he believes what they believe, so Jason is guilty by association. And here's the charge. They are all denying Caesar's decrees. Now remember back to the book of Esther. Haman brought charges against the Jewish people, claiming that they were ignoring the decrees of King Xerxes. So if you ignore the king's decrees, that's a capital offense. And if you're guilty, you deserve to die. So in this case, they are denying the decrees of Caesar, who is the emperor of the Roman Empire, saying there's another king. Well, in the Roman Empire, there was only one king, and that was Caesar. In fact, if you'll remember in the Gospel of John, Jesus is before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate eventually just asked Jesus point blank, "Are you a king?" Because Jesus, if you're a king, we got a problem. Now, if you're not a king, we have no problem. But if you're a king, we've got a problem because, come on, Caesar's the king. But there is another king, one called Jesus, which in some respects is true of the Christian movement. We do have a king. His name is Jesus. But at the same time, Christians were not trying to overthrow the Roman government. Jesus was not out somewhere gathering an army. In fact, Jesus at this point had ascended back into heaven. So if they would have asked, well, where is this Jesus? Well, he's not here. And the Christians are not trying to overthrow the government. So the Christians would have denied that charge. That's not true. We're not trying to form an insurrection against the Roman government and overcome it. So the charge was basically bogus, but it was a capital offense. So if you can get the magistrates to agree, then you've got them. When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. The city officials, the politarchs, as Luke calls them, they're in charge, and they have to keep the peace. But they also have this charge against this group of people, and they have to deal with it in some way. They have to stop the riot and stop it in such a way that it doesn't continue. And that's their goal. Because if they can't keep the peace, the Romans may step in, and they'll lose their free city status, and they could lose their jobs as well. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. So Jason and the others post bond by basically saying, we're going to keep the peace. We're going to take care of Paul and Silas. We're going to make sure that Paul and Silas don't cause any more trouble in the city of Thessalonica. So they post the bond in order to save their lives, in order to end this thing, and then the city magistrates dismiss everyone to go home. This issue is resolved. Riot over. Everybody live in peace. That was the goal. Well, that meant the end of Paul's ministry in Thessalonica. As soon as it was night, which back in the ancient world when it was night, it was really dark. So you really could sneak somebody either in town or out of town very easily in the dark. And so the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. And Berea is about 45 miles away. So Jason, in posting the bond, has to keep the peace. That means Paul and Silas have to leave Thessalonica that day. It also means that Paul can't preach there anymore. And it's also going to mean that Paul can't go back there anymore. And that's a sore spot for Paul. He just started a church there. And he loves these people. He cares about these people. But he has to leave them. And he can't ever go back. Because if he goes back and people see him and there's trouble again, then there's trouble for Jason and the entire church as well. So Paul has to basically leave in order to save the lives of his fellow Christians. So they go to Berea, 45 miles away. And what do? Well, they go into the Jewish synagogue. They're going to start the story all over again. So it's amazing. The Apostle Paul. You would think after that incident in Philippi, when he's beaten, he would say, you know what? We just need to go on vacation for a while. I'm thinking a month or two on the beach, a nice little home on the beach, and we can just, chill out for a while and, heal up from our wounds, and then we'll think about missionary activity again. Not a chance. He leaves Philippi, goes right to Thessalonica, right into the heat of the battle again, and then he has to leave Thessalonica, and he goes to Berea, and he starts the cycle all over again. Well, talking a little bit about the church that's formed, the composition of the church, there are Jewish people in the church, and they grew up, learning about Moses and the law. The Jewish temple at this point is still standing. Some of them may have visited the Jewish temple. They've heard about all of this. And then there's Gentiles. Moses? Who's Moses? They don't know anything about Moses. They don't know anything about the law of God. They don't know any of the Ten Commandments. A few days ago, they were worshiping, idols. Now, those who made it into the Jewish temple, they know something about the Jewish religion. They're the God-fearers. They're part of this too. But Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians that some of you have turned away from idols to serve the living and true God. So, talk about a life change. One day I'm worshiping Zeus and Aphrodite. The next day I'm worshiping Jesus. Complete life change. Now, how would you like to be in charge of those three groups? The Jewish people, the God-fearers, and then we could just call them the pagans, who are now Christians. And somehow you got to bring them into the same room, in the same building, or the same tent, to form a church. I mean, these are different cultures. These are different lifestyles. And somehow the only thing they have in common is they believe in Jesus. Beyond that, they have nothing in common. And you've got the Jewish people, and they only eat certain foods. The Gentiles will eat anything that doesn't eat them. And and you've got to get together and have a love feast, a potluck, and it's like, okay, who brought the pork? The church has got to get along. And that's one of the big challenges in the first century. Some of the men are circumcised and some aren't. And, you've got all kinds of different moral boundaries that people have. Some honor marriage. Some, may have multiple wives and, a few on the side as well, because that was their culture. So somehow they have to be brought together. So that's the composition of the church. And that's a huge challenge for Paul and other Christian leaders trying to bring those groups together. There's another question about how long did Paul stay in Thessalonica. We know from Acts 17, verse 2, that he was there 3 weeks in the Jewish synagogue. So he was there at least 21 days. But there's some information in 1 Thessalonians that suggest that Paul was there more than just 21 days. For example, he began to work his trade. And Paul worked in leather. He was a tent maker. And apparently he needed some money. So he went back to work while he was there, selling his goods in order to support himself. And so he did that. Now, if he was just there for 3 weeks, maybe he didn't need to do that. But if he was there longer, obviously he would. He also provided instruction to the believers. He didn't just give them the gospel and then leave. He provided them instruction about the Christian life. He also taught them about what it meant to live as a Christian. What does following Christ look like? And so he was there long enough to teach them about that. He also developed this close connection with this group. And he's going to talk about that in his letter. Could Paul have done that in 21 days? Probably not. What most likely happened was Paul went into the Jewish synagogue for those 3 Sabbath days. He taught, and at the end of the third one, he got thrown out, which was not abnormal for Paul. So he can't go back to the Jewish synagogue. So he moves in with Jason, who is apparently a convert, somebody who became a Christian. So he's moved into Jason's home, and now he can start spreading the gospel in the marketplace to the Gentiles, which apparently he does. So he was probably there for several weeks. Acts doesn't say how long Paul was in Jason's home. So, as we look at the map again, Paul leaves Thessalonica, he goes to Berea. And guess what happens in Berea? Those Jewish people in Thessalonica who don't like him followed him. I mean, you would think they would have had something better to do. But they travel 45 miles to Berea and cause more trouble for Paul. So Paul has to leave Berea, and he goes down to Athens. However, Timothy and Silas stay in Berea for a little bit longer. So these Jewish opponents are after Paul. Not so sure about Silas and Timothy, but they're definitely after Paul. So eventually Paul says, okay, stay in Berea, but then join me later in Athens. And that's what they do. They come to Athens and they stay with Paul. And then Paul does something rather interesting. Timothy, who's really not mentioned in Acts chapter 17, but who was there with Paul, Paul decides to send Timothy back to Thessalonica. And apparently Timothy was not as well known as Paul, and he could sneak in and find out how the church was doing. Because Paul's concerned. You know, he left in a hurry. There was persecution. Is the church going to survive? Or will everyone wake up the next morning and say, you know what, Paul's not here anymore? And that Jesus stuff, well, maybe I really don't believe that after all. Why don't I just go back to what I believed the day before? And they all went back to their other religion. So that's what Paul was afraid of. That the people in Thessalonica would basically just give up Christianity and pretend the whole thing never happened. So he sends Timothy back to find out how they're doing. In the meantime, Paul doesn't stay long in Athens. He just has limited success in Athens, so he goes to Corinth. And he stays in Corinth for 18 months. So in the meantime, Timothy leaves Thessalonica, comes down, doesn't find Paul in Athens, but he does catch up with Paul in Corinth. And he gives Paul a report about what's going on in Thessalonica. Which brings us to the next part, the writer of 1 Thessalonians. The writer is Paul. He identifies himself in verse 1 as simply Paul, which is kind of interesting. This was maybe Paul's second letter. Galatians was probably the first. But he doesn't call himself the Apostle Paul. He just identifies himself as Paul. In fact, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. He simply lists their names. No qualifications, just their names. So he's the writer. The church fathers quoted this book, and they recognized 1 Thessalonians as being from the Apostle Paul. Irenaeus was the first to quote it specifically, and he did that in about 180 AD. The date of 1 Thessalonians, very early in Paul's ministry. And we know that Paul is in Corinth, and while he's in Corinth, he writes the letter. Because Timothy shows up in Corinth. And Timothy has information about the church in Thessalonica. And for the most part, it's good news. The church still exists. The believers are hanging in there. Yes, there's opposition. Yes, there's persecution. But they're hanging in there. They're still believing. And they are growing. Things are going well at the church in Thessalonica. So that was good news. And Paul knows, I can't go there. Oh, he wanted to go there. But he can't. So instead of going there personally, he sends this letter. He writes this letter. And we don't know how much of the letter may have been written by Silas or Timothy and how much of it is Paul's. We do know from other letters that Paul had really poor eyesight. So when Paul would make his letters, he wouldn't, this scribble stuff, this real little tiny scribble stuff. No, they got to be big letters. So normally when Paul writes a letter, he uses a secretary or an amanuensis. So maybe Silas and or Timothy helped him to write this letter. So Paul is in Corinth. And things are going great in Corinth for a while. He's going to be there for 18 months. But eventually he gets arrested in Corinth. Surprise, surprise. Seems to happen almost everywhere he goes. And it just so happens that the proconsul in Corinth is an individual by the name of Gallio. And we have an inscription that archaeologists have discovered from Delphi that Gallio was there in Corinth for a year at least, beginning in either 51 or 52 AD. And most scholars think it was 51. So the beginning of Gallio's career there in Corinth would have corresponded to the end of Paul's ministry, which would have put Paul in Corinth in about 50 or 51, which meant he wrote 1 Thessalonians in the year 50 or 51, which would have made it very early. Now, most people date Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension in the year 30. Some date it 33. We're talking 20 years after Jesus ascended into heaven that this letter is written. So this is going to give us a lot of information about the early Christians and what they believed and what they were expecting and what they were looking for. Just 20 years after Christ, this letter is written. The purpose of 1 Thessalonians, and again, Paul writes the letter based upon what Timothy tells him. And there are four main things that Paul wants to cover in this letter. And the first one is the condition of the church. The church is doing okay. And for Paul, he breathes a really big sigh of relief that the church did not fold after he left. The church is doing well. Yes, they're facing some opposition. Yes, they're facing some persecution, but they're making it, and they're doing well, and that is good news. The bad news is there's some criticism of Paul. Those fellow Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, who didn't like Paul, just won't quit. They won't give up. So they say to these Christians, oh, that guy named Paul, he left in a hurry, did he not? I mean, if Paul really cared about you, he would have stayed. But he left. What does that say about this guy named Paul? Was he just here for your money? Was he just here for until things got a little tough and, the going got rough? Paul split? And so all of these criticisms of Paul, questioning his character, questioning his sincerity, putting a little bit of doubt into the minds of the Thessalonian Christians. And so Paul's going to address that. And that's when Paul's going to basically say, hey, if I could be there, I could be there, but I can't. And then there's some confusion about the second coming. Apparently, part of Paul's teaching while he was there in Thessalonica concerned the return of Jesus to earth, to set up a kingdom, that Jesus would return and he would restore the fortunes of Israel, and he would set up a kingdom, and all of his people would be involved in his kingdom. And so hang on for that persecution, because Jesus is coming soon, and when Jesus gets here, he's going to make everything right. But even in the short time between Paul's visit and the time he writes this letter, some of the Christians in Thessalonica had passed away. And that raised a question. When Jesus returns, what about deceased Christians? Are they going to miss out on the kingdom because they died before Jesus could return? And that was a real concern that they had. And so Paul writes 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 to address that issue. And you know the answer because you've read it, that the dead in Christ will rise first. They need a 6-foot head start. So they get to rise first. So they're not going to miss out on the kingdom after all. So deceased Christians will be part of that kingdom. And again, this is 20 years after Jesus ascended into heaven. They're asking that question. And here we are, almost still asking that question, 2,000 years later. And then there was the question of, well, when is Jesus coming back? And what should we look for in terms of anticipating Christ's return? And that's a question we're continuing to ask today. Another question was, how should we prepare for Jesus' return? Should I quit my job, put on a white robe, go sit on a hill, and eat grass until Jesus shows up? And Paul would say, not a good idea. But those were some of the concerns of people addressing Jesus' concern. And I use that example because there was a group of people who did that in the 1800s. They quit their jobs, they put on white robes, they went up to a hill, and they sat there for a few days waiting for Jesus to return, and obviously he did not. Well, the last thing that Paul wants to address is community life. We talked about this a little bit. You have Jewish people, you have God-fearers, and you have pagans in the church, and there are issues that come up, issues of fellowship, issues of morality. How do I live as a Christian? What does that look like? And for the Jewish people, probably not that much of a change. But for the Gentiles, especially the ones who didn't know anything about Judaism, a huge change. Gentiles, back in the first century, were not known for their morality. In fact, it was quite common to be married to someone because you have to have legitimate children. But you could have, either a male or a female on the side as well. And especially among the Greeks, homosexuality was quite common. And so now you have to re-educate all of these people about who is God. That God is holy, that would have been a new concept. Because Zeus was not holy. Aphrodite was anything but holy. But the true God of heaven is holy, and he wants me to live that way too. That was a change for these Gentile people. A complete life change. So Paul wants to address that very big issue of how do I live as a follower of Christ. Well, the last thing I have in your notes is the outline of 1 Thessalonians, and that's subject to change as I go through the book. But it begins with the letter opening, and we're going to start there next week. Then there's a prayer of thanksgiving, and it was common for Paul in writing a letter to pray a prayer of thanksgiving for his readers. In fact, it was so common, he does it in almost every letter except for the letter to the Galatians. Because Paul was mad when he wrote the letter to the Galatians. He was not thankful for them for what they had done. He was quite upset with them. Then Paul's going to remember his time in Thessalonica. He's going to rehearse that. And he's going to talk about his relationship with the people at the church at Thessalonica. And then in chapter 4 is that encouragement to Christian living. How to live as a Christian. Then understanding the second coming. Paul's going to review that information and try to answer some of their questions. And then it'll be the concluding encouragement and then the benediction and the greeting. So there's 5 chapters, and we'll tackle chapter 1, verse 1 beginning next week and go verse by verse until we reach the end of the book. Tonight we learned a little bit about Paul, the guy who just would not quit. It's amazing on that second missionary journey, as we call it, the churches that were started, and many of the letters we have in our Bible today were written by Paul to those churches that he started during that second missionary journey, like Philippians and Ephesians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And you sometimes wonder, what if he would have quit? Yeah, Paul was not a quitter. No matter how difficult it got, he refused to quit. In fact, we know from the stories that Paul didn't like quitters, because there was a guy named John Mark who went on the first missionary journey who quit, and then Barnabas wanted to take John Mark back on the second missionary journey, and Paul said, over my dead body, he's going with us. And so Barnabas and John Mark went on their own missionary journey, and then Silas joined Paul on that second missionary journey. So as we think about our own faith, don't quit. No matter what happens, hang on to Jesus. Hang on to your faith. Be strong in the Lord. That's what Paul would tell the Thessalonians, and that's what Paul would tell us today as well. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this book. Thank you for all the things that were going on in the background of this story. And Father, I pray that as we think about this and think about the Apostle Paul and his tenacity, in his determination, in his unwillingness to let anything stop him, may that be true of our response to Christ as well, that we're going to continue to believe, continue to hope, continue to have faith, no matter what happens. So, Father, grow us in our faith, strengthen us, help us to see that our faith is what needs to grow, and that's what needs to develop. And I pray that it will as we continue this study next week. So, Father, thank you for Christ. Thank you for the fact that we can be part of your family. And thank you for the opportunity to study this letter that can help us grow in our faith and get closer to you as well. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.